Okay, today we are in one of the most famous sections of the Bible. We are looking at Exodus chapter 20, where God gave the people of Israel the 10 Commandments. And before we walk through the 10 Commandments, yes, you are going to have a 10-point sermon today, okay? Sorry. We usually do 3, but there's 10 points in this sermon, and you're just going to have to get through them all. Before we get into that, I want to give you just a little bit of background information. I've been talking about this more the last couple weeks in the series because it gives you a little understanding or context of the scripture here. When Israel and his sons moved to Egypt, they were about 70 people, according to Genesis 46. So they weren't a nation at this point. They were just a family. And by the time they left Egypt in dramatic fashion, they were over 1 million people. So there are several changes that are happening in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They'd never before had a plot of land that they could call their own. No territory that they could define as their nation. They'd never had an organized system of government. They'd never had formal written instructions regarding civil or judicial or economic policy. They had no written instructions about worship, and they'd never had a designated civic leader. No king, no prophet, no president. So this moment in their history really begins to define this formal written law that served as the foundation of their nation. Having said all that, let's jump into the text, Exodus 20, verse 1. Then God gave the people, gave the people all these instructions. So the Old Testament law is commonly referred to as the law of Moses. You can use those terms interchangeably. And the law of Moses, or the Old Testament law, begins with the 10 Commandments. And I want you to notice that verse 1 says these commandments were given to all the people. If you were here last week, you'll remember that the people had gathered around the mountain, Mount Sinai. It was quite the experience. God's presence descended on Mount Sinai, and when he arrived, there was wind and thunder and lightning and fire and smoke and earthquakes. This wasn't one of those twin fall storms that kind of cranks up for 20 minutes and then it's gone. This was an unmistakable supernatural interruption by the Most High God who created heaven and earth. And when he spoke, his whole assembled people had gathered around him, and he began by giving them the 10 Commandments. These are the words he wants his people to live by. And if you think about it, all religions, all cultures, all civilized societies have spoken and unspoken rules that they live by. One of the rules I live by is you always walk down an aisle or a hallway on the right-hand side. And there's other people that don't know that rule, and so they're always walking into me. You know, if you ever go to a national park like Grand Canyon, people from around the world, they always go on the left side, so they're always running into you. And I'm like, you don't understand. In America, we drive on the right. So move over, right? There's written and unwritten rules in every culture, things that people live by. And we have like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in our country. In history, there's these famous documents like the Magna Carta and the Pax Romana and the Treaty of Versailles and all these famous documents that defined how people were going to live, how they were going to be. But none of those even come close to the legacy of the 10 Commandments, which have stood the test of time for almost 3,000 years. It's worth noting that the 10 Commandments actually fall into 2 categories. The first 4 are instructions about how we relate to our God, and the last 6 commandments are instructions about how we relate to one another. Having said that, let's jump into the first commandment in verse 2. I'm the Lord your God, who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. You must not have any other God but me. This seems pretty obvious. God is saying to his people, I'm the Lord. I'm your God. I'm the one who did the miracles in Egypt. I'm the one who parted the Red Sea. I'm the one who defeated Pharaoh's army. There are lots of so-called gods out there, but your God is me. I'm the Lord of all lords and the God of all gods. And the first commandment is that you should not have, must not have any other God but the Lord. Let's geek out for like 30 seconds on that. Okay. This means that the nation of Israel was officially monotheistic. That's a fancy word you can use at parties to impress your friends. That means that they're a one God people. And that doesn't sound too radical for us as Christians. But remember that the people of Egypt were all about the pagan pantheon pantheons, and all the pagan nations around them all had these multiple hosts of gods. And he tells his people, that's over, and now there's only one God, and there's always been one God all along, and it's me. All the others are imposters. They're not worthy of your praise, so you're not to have any other gods. Here's the second commandment in verse 4. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or the earth or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate your affection for other gods. Again, pretty straightforward. I'm your only God, and you're not to make any other gods. Don't make any gods. Don't bow down to them. And while you might think the first commandment kind of covers that, we're going to find out, actually next Sunday, that Israel had a big problem with making and bowing down to handmade idols. We'll see next Sunday in the story of the golden calf. But the second commandment is very specific to idol worship. And as Americans in a modern age, we don't often think about, like carving out a god for ourselves with our 3D printer and then bowing down to it or praying to it or offering sacrifices to it. That seems silly. That seems primitive. It seems like something that superstitious people would do in a third world nation. If you travel internationally, you'd be surprised how much of this still goes on in our world. I remember being in China on a mission trip, and there was a woman who came to hear what we were talking about, and she was interested in Jesus. And so we sat down and we shared with her what Jesus had done, that he came and he lived a sinless life with regular people, that he loved her so much that he died for her sins, that he was raised to life, proving he had power over life and death. And we shared the gospel with her, and she believed and received eternal life that day. And as we're talking to the translator, he pointed out that she had a bracelet on her wrist with a dog's tooth on it, and she had a little carved necklace of Buddha on her neck. And I said to her, after the translator pointed this out to me, I said, you now serve the living God. You don't need a carving of a dead man or a dead dog's tooth. You have Jesus. And she immediately took those things off and threw them away. That's idolatry. But that's not our hang-up with idolatry. Most of us aren't being trapped by things like that. The idols we create for ourselves are much more subtle. And I think we have all these idols in our society that we don't recognize. For example, I'll give you a couple of quick examples. I think one of our idols is that we feel the need to constantly be connected and or entertained, which can all be accomplished by a little electronic device in our pockets. And some of you didn't hear me say that because you're playing on your phones right now, your iPhone. The I probably stands for idol, okay? Our idols are things like comfort, right? I mean, it's in the title, guys. It's a giveaway. Our idols are things like comfort. We don't want anyone or anything to take away our time or money. We don't want to be inconvenienced. We don't want to attempt anything that's hard or could cost us because we just want to be comfortable. Our idols are more subtle. Our idols are things like the government, hoping that they're going to take care of us if you're of a certain stripe. Or others trust in their freedom or their education, or others in their activities. Their idols are sports or cars or money or fishing or hunting or whatever. The point is that this is not for us. We're not to give anything the allegiance that belongs only to God. And God says, I'm a jealous God. What's that mean? Jealousy usually sounds bad to us. Like if you're jealous that the cute girl picked your buddy over you, that's not what we're talking about. Jealous that the Ducks made the Big Ten and the Beavers in the mountain have to go to the Mountain West, Wes. Not that kind of jealousy. God desires for you to know Him and love Him and to be in a covenant with Him. And it's not for His sake, it's for yours. You understand that? He wants you to know the joy and the life and the love and the peace and the satisfaction and the hope that comes from knowing the living God. He wants you to avoid heartache and pain and loss and fear and discouragement, all the stuff that comes from living apart from Him, the suffering that we experience in our souls that we pass on to generations. And that's what He says next. Listen to the next part. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations of those who reject me. Now, at first glance, you might read that and go, wait a minute, if I sin, if I worship other gods, if I make other gods, then God's going to punish my kids and grandkids? Not exactly. It's more like your kids and grandkids will follow the sinful patterns that you've established. And so in doing so, they will suffer for your sins for generations. And this is not a newsflash. Some of you inherited some pretty crummy family values, and you're working to fight out of those and to not do what your parents and your grandparents and great-grandparents did. And some of you are parents, and you're trying to pass on godly values for generations to your descendants. Whether you want to call this generational sin or patterns of dysfunction, we all know what God is saying here. There's consequences for your behavior outside of just you. The things you do will affect your family. But he says, I lavish love, unfailing love, for 1,000 generations on those who love me and obey my command. Two paths, opposite directions, with God, away from God, your choice, your life, your consequences. God will bless or curse the decisions that you make. The people who follow behind you will experience the blessings or curses of your decisions. So let me quickly say on that note that as we think about discipleship, we've been talking about a lot lately and more to come in the next few weeks. Everyone is being discipled by somebody. And everybody's discipling someone else. If you want to put it this way, who are you allowing to influence you, and how are you influencing others? Are you walking with the Lord or walking away from Him? It's your call. Here's the third commandment. You must not misuse the name of the Lord your God. The Lord will not let you go unpunished if you misuse His name. This is the word where we get the word blasphemy from. The idea is we're not using God's name as a swear word. And I know that people do this. Many people do it. They don't think about it. They're probably doing it rather innocently. But when you're shocked, you throw out an OMG. When someone doubts you, you say, I swear to God. When you're mad, you say GD or even Jesus Christ like it's a swear word. These are not expressions that God's people should say. We're not to misuse His name. But it's more than just swearing. It's speaking of the Lord or His Christ or the Holy Spirit in casual or frivolous ways. The idea is this: remember who you're talking to. Remember who you're dealing with. And here's the fourth commandment. Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, any foreigners living among you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. But on the seventh day he rested, and that is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. Of the 10 commandments, number 4 is the most misunderstood. People don't know what to do with the fourth commandment. God's plan for His people, Israel, was that they would have a day set aside to rest from their work. This was especially relevant for Israel in a couple of ways that it isn't relevant to us. First of all, this is establishing a rhythm for their new nation. If you think about it, everybody in here knows, for the most part, that Saturday is the day off. And most businesses reflect that. Some of you have to work weekends, sorry for that. But most of us don't, and it's already an established thing. We didn't create that. We didn't set it in motion. We didn't vote on it. It's just how it is. They're starting a new nation, and God's saying, okay, here's how it's going to go. Saturday is going to be a day of rest. So they're establishing this for their new norm, for their new nation. It's also related to their formalized system of worship. So keeping the Sabbath day was part of the worship of God, part of the covenant that He was establishing with Israel. And so people rightly wonder, they ask, do we as Christians still have to follow the Sabbath? And the answer is no. This is only one of the 10 commandments that's not reiterated in the New Testament. So no, we don't have to. But perhaps a better question is, should we? Should we have a day set apart where we slow down, clear the calendar, enjoy our family, enjoy God's gift of rest. Should we? Well, of course we should. But not because we have to, because we get to. In fact, in the New Testament, Jesus promised he would kind of give us a kind of rest for our souls. So what's different about that is that's not a day of the week, that's a life we live. That's a lifestyle that we live. We're people who've received rest from Christ. And so we rest in the knowledge and the comfort of our relationship with Jesus, and that's an everyday, all the time kind of thing. Those are the first four. And again, they establish how people are to relate to God. The second half instructed them how to live with each other. And this is really important. Again, brand new nation. They needed a set of guidelines that everybody could kind of agree upon and live by, a baseline set of values, if you will. And here's what's interesting. The last 6 commandments are almost universally agreed upon. Almost all cultures and people across time and history would agree that these 6 things are things that are matters of right and wrong, and they would just know deep down in an internal way that these things are good and they should probably follow them, whether they've ever heard or read about the 10 Commandments or not. There are always exceptions, so I'll just get that out of the way. But at face value, almost all societies in history would agree with these 6 principles in the last 6 commandments. Here's the first one. Ready? Kids in the room, ready? Honor your father and mother. Then you will live long, because they won't kill you. You will live a long, full life in the land the Lord your God has given you. This is part of God's vision for family, that a man and a woman, a father and a mother, have children and raise them together. And children are to show honor to their parents. You students in the room, this especially applies to you. Your parents, teenagers, listen, your parents love you. I know you don't think so sometimes, but they really do love you. It was not convenient to have you, okay? It's still not. They took the chance and had you anyways. They work every day to provide for you. They lose sleep as they worry about your little souls. They care more for you than any person on the planet will ever care for you. They want nothing but your happiness and success. They work and they pray and they try hard to pave a path for you so all that can happen. They cook and clean and give up time and money. They feed you and shelter you and buy you stuff. And they are worthy of honor even if they're annoying sometimes. And parents, you are annoying sometimes. It's your job description. How do you show honor to your father and mother? You show them honor by the way you talk and the way you act and the way you respond to their instructions. These are all good reasons for you to honor your parents, kids, but if that's not enough, God says you have to. And parents, your part of this is to act honorably. If you want honor from your kids, act honorably. This is part of the fabric of family by God's design, but it's also part of the fabric for society. When children grow up disrespectful and treat parents with contempt, you know what's going to happen in their life moving forward, don't you? It's a path of pain. Some of you have walked that path. Learning to show honor and respect to people in authority will help you have a good life and spare you pain. We eventually, all of us, leave the care of our parents and we no longer answer to them, but we still should try to show them honor. Almost every society has this notion that mothers and fathers should be honored and respected. How do you argue with that? It's pretty straightforward. Here's the next one. Also universally agreed upon. Ready? You must not murder. That seems pretty straightforward. Do I need to explain that? Don't kill people. There are people that would take this to mean that no one should ever take someone else's life, and to do so is breaking the commandment, and they make a whole case for pacifism and all this. That's not what the scripture is talking about here. This commandment speaks of a person killing another person in a personal way. It's not taking someone's life in the service of your country's military. This is not taking someone's life in the duty of law enforcement. This is not defending your family from imminent harm. This is crime of passion stuff. Killing someone in the heat of the moment, or a crime of revenge, killing someone for paybacks, or it's the crime of an assassin or a jilted lover or some dude with anger management issues. But again, all societies throughout history understand that murdering people is not good. And God says we must not do that. It's not how we handle problems with people. Commandment number 7 says you must not commit adultery. Even in godless societies, it's pretty much understood that you don't mess around with another man's wife or another woman's husband. It's one of those kind of betrayals that undermines the stability of families. But in the biblical sexual ethic, it's even more than that. It's taking sex outside of the confines of the one place where God says it's blessed, which is marriage. A man, a woman, marriage. Anything outside of that would be called, scripturally speaking, called adultery. Here's the 8th commandment, also universally agreed upon. You must not steal. Again, don't take stuff that's not yours. In every nation of the world, there's rules about taking other people's stuff. There's consequences. There's jail time. Everybody knows this is wrong. Wes had his car broken into last night. That was wrong. My mother is so conscientious about stealing that if she walked out of a bank with a pen from the bank, she'll drive back to take back the pen. And I've told her over and over, Mom, you know they give those away, right? And she's like, but I didn't ask for it. And so it's stealing and I'm taking it back. Imagine if everybody operated like that. Imagine a society with no stealing. You could leave your car doors unlocked. You could leave your house unlocked. Prices would be lower at all the stores. Banks wouldn't have security guards. Stores wouldn't need loss prevention people. The jails would be half empty. No one would have security cameras. You wouldn't need pins on your debit card. No identity theft, no fraud, no embezzlement. If all the people honored the 8th commandment, there would be a different world. And you'll notice that taking things that aren't ours is actually a theme in the commandments. Think about this. We don't take worship that belongs to God in the 1st and 2nd commandment and give it to someone else. We don't take the name of God and misuse it. We don't take the gift of rest and abuse it. We don't take honor from our parents. We don't take the lives of other people. We don't take sexuality out to someone else's marriage bed. We don't take other people's personal property. There's a theme here developing in the 10 Commandments. And in the 9th commandment, you don't take someone's good reputation from them. That's what the 9th commandment says. You must not testify falsely against your neighbor. You don't lie about other people. Specifically, this applies to a legal setting. So if someone lies in a court of law or lies to a law enforcement official in order to get someone else in trouble, that's bearing false witness. You don't try to get someone in trouble, but it also just kind of applies generally. Societies, communities, church bodies, we all do better when people aren't running each other down, when you're not casting people in a negative light. Some of you work in office environments where there's a lot of backbiting and backstabbing and gossip and running each other down, and you know what I mean. But we don't do that. It doesn't produce a good culture, work environment, family environment, any of that. It's easy to get to talking and say things you shouldn't say. The 9th commandment is a reminder not to run people down, not to say bad things about people. Verse 17 is commandment 10. This is our last one. You must not covet your neighbor's house. You must not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female servant, ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. Don't be greedy or jealous for what other people have. Don't long for their stuff. Don't think about what it'd be like to drive their car, have their house or wife or donkey. I did see a rather nice donkey the other day and I had to check myself. Be content with what you have. Church, Americans, be content with what you have. This covetous desire is a powerful force at work in our hearts. Breaking the 10th commandment almost always leads you to break other commandments. And when God formed a nation, these are the things he wanted all his people to know. And they kind of hit on a couple of different levels. These are morals, that God wanted his people to adopt. But the Ten Commandments were also civic. They were shared values that he wanted his nation to live by. The Ten Commandments broadly defined how people were to relate to God and how people related to their neighbor. And all 10 of these, now if you keep reading in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and parts of Deuteronomy, what you find is that these 10 principles are expanded upon. The application of these principles are kind of spelled out for you. And all these pieces of the law were given on Mount Sinai. And everyone was there. All the nation had gathered and heard as God himself spoke these 10 things to everybody. And you have to wonder, how did that go? How did they respond? Verse 18 tells us, when the people heard the thunder and the loud blast of the ram's horn, and when they saw the flashes of lightning and the smoke billowing from the mountain, they stood at a distance trembling with fear. They weren't trembling because of the commandments. They were trembling because the presence of God was so awesome that the creation reacted. It's just the creation reacting to the arrival of the Creator. And it was so overwhelming that in verse 19, they said to Moses, "You speak to us and we will listen, but don't let God speak directly to us or we will die." God's heavenly presence on earth was so overwhelming that they literally couldn't stand it. And they asked, this is crazy to me, they asked God not to speak to them anymore. And I don't know why, but I read that this week, and part of it just made me sad, you know? It's like, here's the people of God. He's getting ready to build a nation out of them, and they're like, God, could you just not talk to us anymore? We'll just talk to that guy over there. That's fine. We'll talk to him. They preferred to hear it from Moses instead. And you know what? I think if we're being honest, there's a lot of us that are still afraid to hear from God. We're afraid he's going to tell us things we don't want to hear and show us things that we don't want to see, that he's going to call us to things that are going to be a challenge or uncomfortable for us. And it's easier just to talk to the pastor or just watch one on TV than to have encounters with the living God. I don't ever want us to be a people that are afraid to hear from the Lord. And Moses said to them in verse 20, don't be afraid. You don't have to be afraid of God. For God has come in this way to test you, and so that your fear of him will keep you from sinning. And all the people stood in the distance. They're backed up way back away from Mount Sinai. And Moses approached the dark cloud where God was. It's a really interesting scene. It's like the mountain we read last week was covered in smoke and clouds, and it's kind of dark and obscured. The vision is obscured, and all the people are standing back there. And after hearing these commandments, and Moses is turning to the people and reassuring them, and then he begins to walk up that cloudy mountain into the mist, and end scene, you know, it's like a dramatic Hollywood picture where he just like disappears in the fog, and you'll have to come back next week to hear what happened. Moses reassured them. He explained God's reason for appearing and speaking to them in such a way. And then he walked back up into the presence of God unafraid, because it says, we remember last week we looked at Moses talked to God like a man talks to a friend. And guys, because of what Jesus has done, we no longer have to be afraid of having those encounters with the living God. His Spirit lives within us. Christ died for us. We are loved. We are chosen. We are the people who are in covenant with God because of what Christ has done. We don't approach God's presence on our own merits, but on the merits of Jesus. And so when Moses was on the mountain of God, the people decided to break the first and second commandment. Come back next Sunday and we'll talk about that.